Hey there everyone, welcome back. This is Will Nations Dev, and we are going to be resuming our little tour of Godot Next. Let's jump right back in. We were kind of going through a list of some use cases that show up within Godot Next, and we're going to be doing a little demo of how they work and how they're built in, and what you can do with Godot Next. As a brief reminder, you can always open issues for new types of things that you'd like to add to the repository. Fully submit pull requests, and I'll review them. And I want everyone to feel welcome to kind of participate and think about how they can expand this collection of extensions for Godot. So, all right, let's just dive right in. So, question number 3. Last time we covered the variant class. Now we're going to be checking out something else. So, have you ever wanted multiple scripts per node? All right. Well, we have a system for this, which is we created a CallbackDelegator node. We combined this with behavior resources. You don't necessarily have to use our behavior class that we made, as long as the thing that you made matches the interface for it, and you can just look at the class to see what properties and stuff it has. It's mainly, well, I'll get to it soon, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to have the inspector show a collection of behavior resources, and then the CallbackDelegator node, which owns this collection of resources, is going to, as a node, it'll have a collection of callbacks, and it'll start delegating those callbacks to the scripts inside the resource collection, right? So you have something. You have some list of resources, and all those resources, if they define one of the callback notifications, so like ready, and like underscore ready, underscore enter tree, underscore, process with a delta, all those different things will end up getting picked up by the resources. So you can supply a base type script, and you can also click a little button that'll initialize it with the behavior. But so if you want to define your own base type rather than it being behavior, you can do that. And then this feeds into a ResourceSet object, which is just a private property on the CallbackDelegator. ResourceSet, for those who are unaware, a set is a data structure that is it's basically a key value, or not key value. It's a key store that just stores unique script references in this case. Or rather, you have, a set is basically something that says you can't have more than one of a particular type of something, right? So if my set is saying you can store, anything that's a resource, well, if I add one type of resource, then I can't add another resource of the same type, right? That's what a resource set will do for you. And the way we implement it is just that it's a dictionary with no values. So it just uses the key portion of a dictionary, and that's how we did it. But all the resources that we stuff into our CallbackDelegator, all the behaviors, have an owner property that'll point back to the CallbackDelegator. They'll have an enabled property that specifies whether they're toggled on or off. So you can just easily say without actually taking away the resource, you can just say count this or don't count it, right? And you get to program what happens when it's enabled or disabled, right? So that we have dedicated callbacks for handling that. And then lastly, as mentioned, all of the node notifications that are present in the CallbackDelegator node will actually be delegated to the resources. So every resource will receive the notification callbacks from the delegator node. This is a really big deal because, why would you want to do this? This is, if you ever want to have multiple scripts per node, the big problem in the current version of the engine, let's see if I jump in and go to a CallbackDelegator test, right? Close that. We don't want to do that. I don't want to see this stuff yet. clear. Here we go. Okay, so resave that. We'll get to that soon. But yeah, so if you want to have multiple scripts, essentially, if you want to do components, the current workflow in Godot 3.1 is you have to create a whole bunch of child nodes, right? So I'd make a node. Oh man, okay, node, and I would create that, and I would click here, and I'd say, oh, I want to add a script, and I don't really want to do that right now, but so you would add a script to it, and then you'd add logic to the script that says, oh, when I enter the tree, so I have a parent, get the parent, and then do this stuff to the parent, and then if I exit tree, then undo these things to the parent, or whatever. Or maybe you start triggering into behaviors that, like, oh, the parent does something, now I'm going to do something, right? That's how you would make a component, is you'd start having a child that gets really busybody and worrying about what its parent is doing. We don't really want that. We don't want nodes to be caring so much about their environment. It's not really ideal. You want your nodes to be able to operate independently. That's kind of the idea behind them. Not all of them are like that, of course. There are exceptions. And these component, you could say that these component nodes are part of those exceptions, but we don't just want that happening all the time. And it would be nice if you did have properties on this node, right? Well, if I have it as a component, I want to just be able to click and see all the different components in the inspector, right? I can't do that if they're in these other nodes. I have to click to the node to view its inspector, right? It's just troublesome. And then furthermore, the nodes themselves, let's say you have, 10 components for, like, oh, I make a player object and he's got all these different components that give him features. So let's say I have 10 of them. Well, it's not just the player. I also want to have these features for every single NPC in my game as well. And then maybe like 2 or 3 extras for the player. I don't know. So let's say on average, you'll have 10 child nodes per, one node that is your scene for the character, right? Well, that scene is going to have all kinds of other stuff inside of it. It'll have animation players and kinematic bodies or something, and then, some kind of physics thing, maybe some areas inside of it. Maybe it'll have a mesh or a sprite or, whatever it is. It'll have all kinds of stuff inside of it. That's just for the actual features available to it. And then we're going to start adding all of these logic nodes that start executing behaviors and doing stuff during process. And, we just have a whole bunch of scripted functionality that we're going to tack on with a bunch of different nodes. If, this is kind of fine at a small scale, where you have, maybe you might end up creating 50 nodes for, or maybe that's extreme, like 20 nodes for a single character in your game. So then, like, oh, 20 nodes, okay, that's totally fine if I have, 1,000, or if I, 1,000. Well, yeah, if you have like 1,000 characters in a scene, in a single scene, or maybe 500 characters, it might still be reasonable, but it's just like the more and more you scale it up, and especially the more complex you make the objects where you add more child nodes, those nodes get really expensive. I remember this one user on Reddit who reported having like I think it was 20,000 nodes or 10,000, something like that. He got to some like 10 or 20k nodes, and he started to get frames per second drops under 60 FPS. And it was just because he had, or he not just under 60, he got like really low amounts in the like tens or 20 frames per second, just because he had all these nodes. And then when he followed my advice and converted all these child node scripts to resource scripts, he ended up getting a massive performance boost, right? So resources are much more lightweight than nodes, generally speaking. And so it would be really nice if we could just move all these nodes into resources. It consolidates all the information. Because they're resources, you can save and load them directly. You don't need to then have a node that has the resource that you save and then interact with the node's properties and the resource properties. And it's just like, I just want to deal with the resources directly. And so that's what we're doing here. And so get rid of this. And jumping in. So let's say I have here I have my callback delegator. I've just created this class. I haven't initialized it or anything. I don't do anything with it. And I'm like, okay, how do I deal with this? What do I do? Well, since I don't have anything in mind, I'm going to initialize it with a default behavior script, right? And let's clear these out. Okay, so right now I have an empty data, right? I have the data from my resource set, my resource collection, whatever, is empty. And then we have a special class in Godot Next that helps us to find the derived types of any other type. So I have this, and we'll talk about that later on. And so because we supplied behavior.gd, it now gives us this dropdown that has all of our behavior scripts in our project. So if I look in here, I have behaviors, click on stats.gd, we see it's a tool script and that it has a class name, it extends behavior, and each of these things are important, right? You have to be extending whatever the base type is. You have to be a tool script, I'm pretty sure you have to be a tool script, because usually it can't load the script in the editor otherwise. And then you have to have a class name in order for it to get picked up into this dropdown. So anyway, I come in here, I say stats, I hit plus, and voila, we get a stats. And I can expand this out, and I'm exporting my health so it shows up here, and I can increment it, and this will serialize the instance of the stats class into my scene, my callback delegator scene. And then you can also like load in, if you wanted to, you could do load and you could pick a serialized TRES file that you are storing on your file system. So you could do that too. It just by default will create an instance for you. So that's that. And then we get to some more crazy stuff. So you might be wondering, how do I have this drop down? Like, how did I get this here? And this plus button, and then this button up here. So Godot Engine in 3.1 introduced this thing called DelegationInspectorPlugin, which if you have a Godot Next plugin. All right, so you have an editor plugin, right? You can load in this editor inspector plugin class and you say add inspector plugin, and you just provide the instance of it, and it'll inject content into your inspector whenever the relevant classes are being edited, right? Very, very cool. Now, what I didn't like about this concept as it was initially introduced was that if you wanted to have different objects that each get their own GUI, you have to have a different editor inspector that you're, or not have to, but, the editor inspector plugin just tells you how to deal with a particular thing. You could have the same plugin handle multiple objects, but it's just messy having, like, if I'm just an average Joe Blow user and I come in and I'm like, oh, I really wish I could add a button to my object. I don't want to have to create a plugin, create an editor inspector plugin, load it in, create an instance of it, and then add it in my editor plugin. Like, it's just, oh my gosh, so much work to do all of that. So annoying. Instead, I created this delegation inspector plugin. The initial idea was proposed by XD Game Studios, and I refined the idea a bit more. And we ended up with this result. So what it does is the delegation inspector plugin, you usually have these methods like parse begin, parse category, parse property, parse end. And these are basically saying, when you are parsing the beginning of the inspector, or when you're parsing one of the categories like resource or reference, when you're parsing an individual property, or when you're parsing the end of an inspector, do this stuff, right? And you have this, there's an add custom control method that's part of the editor inspector plugin, where you basically just make any kind of GUI you want, plug it in, and it'll inject it, right? So you get full control over injecting things into the inspector, and you can actually do really cool stuff. Well, rather than doing it here in the editor inspector plugin, I made a delegation inspector plugin where it delegates these requests to the object that is being edited. So it says, oh, I have parsing the begin. So I append this to the object stack because you can have like sub inspectors for resources. So there's actually a stack of inspectors, a stack of objects being edited. And we say like, oh, well, so does it have a virtual underscore parse begin, right? So underscore parse begin, does it have that method? If so, call it and pass yourself in, self being the editor inspector plugin. So you're just handing off an instance of the editor inspector plugin to the object that's being edited, and it can do whatever the heck it wants with it. So that's what we did, right? We're like, oh, we have all this GUI stuff. You'll see here in the CallbackDelegator script, I have this is how I comment things. I have this override section here, and I do parse property, right? So parse property takes in editor inspector plugin. It also takes in a property info, which is a custom type or a script class that Godot Next defines. Basically, all the information associated with a property gets stuffed into it. So I can say pinfo.name, and the name of the property is underscore elements, right? Which is why when we were in here, we saw elements. That's what this is, right? Well, if it's elements, then I want you to add a custom control to the inspector. And we have this little factory method for building a button. And that's what results in this initialize default behavior thing, right? And so when I do that, I have this helper method that initializes it with a behavior. And that's just something we have at the bottom of this file. But you can do that with anything, right? So this setup right here, I will add a breath to it. Now I have a breath resource. Expand this out. Whoa, I get lots of stuff, right? So let me jump to my breath, and we can see it in action here. Okay. So we have a parse begin, which inserts our hello world right here, and a button with ++, the increment, and then when you click it, we connect it to a signal, again on the same object. And in this case, it updates the rate, which is some property that we have on here. Breathing rate, haha, okay. And then you call this method, which is property list change notify. It tells the editor, hey, this object's property list was changed somehow. You will want to update the inspector, right? That's what this is. So if you don't call this method, then it'll change the data without updating the inspector. So you won't actually see the data change unless you click off and back on again, and then it reloads the inspector, right? Well, if you don't want to have to do that, call this method and it'll change immediately, right? So I click this button and bam, the number increases immediately. Then we have this goodbye world that is done in parse end. You can also do, as I mentioned before, parse property and parse category, and so you can like jump into certain things. And if we look here, you'll actually notice, so I have, this is happening in the callback delegator. This breath with the plus button thing, this drop down, this is happening in the resource set, actually. The script that defines the resource set actually has this logic for appending this content. And then when I expand out my breath, I get this other custom GUI, right? So there's all kinds of like layers of customized functionality happening between multiple classes, which just makes the inspector so much more flexible and powerful. So I think this right here is a pretty big, like the delegation inspector plugin is a pretty big game changer by itself. And then we're combining it with the callback delegator, which allows you to, have all these different resources that are built into your script. Now, you might be wondering, well, Will, why is that such a big deal? We can add, an array of resources to our nodes no matter what. Like, not a big deal. Why is this so crazy? Um, you actually can't really do this in Godot 3.1. Um, you can export a resource, but if you have a custom resource of some kind, right? So here I'm loading my resource script, which if you had a script class, you could just access it like whatever the name of your type is. Class name my resource, like this. Doing this in a script is essentially the equivalent of including it like this. Not exactly, because it creates a global variable, but you're still getting the same thing, right? You're just getting a loaded version of the script. So what I'd like to be able to do is just say my resource, right? You can't do that. Export hint is not a resource type, right? So in 3.1, GDScript does not yet understand how to interpret a preloaded constant or a global script class as a resource type. So you can't say you can only assign my resource types to this variable in the inspector. That's not something you can do yet. And furthermore, because of that, you can't do it for an array, which just extrapolates it out to a series of entries, basically. So it's not something that you can do already, which is why this feature is so useful, like the fact that you can do it. So this is why you can set up a base type and then it actually generates a drop-down of options for you, and you can just add whatever the heck you want and customize the GUI associated with each one. It's really, really powerful, really flexible, and I haven't even gotten to the best part, which is the actual callback delegations, right? So let's look at breath.gd. I have a func_ready method in here, but what? This extends behavior. All right, and behavior is a resource. How could it possibly do that? Well, as mentioned many times already, this will delegate its callbacks to the object in question, right? So if I look at my callback delegator, we have this list of callbacks here, right? So all of these different callbacks, if your resource implements any functions with these names, they'll get called. They'll actually get the data passed along to them, and you could just handle them in your resource script. It's so cool, right? So I have hello world in here. Let's see me run this. And bam, hello world, right? Just the one thing in here. We set up our stuff and it triggered just as we were hoping, okay? So there's a whole bunch of content in this video. It ran a little bit long, but I think this is just some really cool stuff. And Godot Next is what makes it possible, and hopefully you too can contribute to this project and really help it shine and gain a following of its own, because it has so much potential. Like if people just come together and we all share our great ideas of like, oh, it would be cool if Godot could do X, right? And it's something that you think the engine should naturally be able to do, then that's something that we should be able to put in Godot Next, right? I'd like Godot Next to be something where someone installs the engine and then they're like, oh man, the engine doesn't have X feature yet, but I could just write a script to do it and then it would be done. Like, okay, great, do that. And then put it in Godot Next and then everybody will have it. So it's just like a go-to thing that you install when you're creating a new project, right? That would be awesome if it could be like that. And maybe down the line we'll have some sort of Git submodules in here, and you can conditionally load in the various different specialized plugins or something like that. That's way down the line. We can figure out details as we go, as it gets bigger, but there's a lot here. So we covered thus far where, oh, of course I got rid of it. Okay, use cases. All right, so we've covered the callback delegator and the behavior script, how we can define collections of resources. As an example, we gave the resource set. You might not realize yet, but we actually have in here resource collections, and we have a resource array, a base resource collection, and then resource set. So you can actually have all kinds of different data structures that manage a collection of resources, and we've extrapolated it out so that you can actually define your own data structures that would also work in the inspector, and you can just customize how they function. So feel free to check those classes out and get a sense for how they work. And if you have any questions, feel free to message me or XD Game Studios. And he's done so much work on the project. He knows very well how they operate. I hope you guys really enjoyed that, and we will be moving along next time. See you around.